As Alexander Blackwell left the grand hall of the gala, his footsteps echoed down the cold, nearly deserted street. The night was a harsh one, a biting wind cutting through his tailored coat as he pulled the collar up, muttering to himself about the chill. Yet, as he continued down the street, something caught his eye in the dim glow of a street lamp. A young woman was huddled on a bench, clutching a thin, worn jacket around her shoulders, her face tight with worry. Next to her, a small boy lay curled up, shivering even in his sleep. Alexander slowed, an unfamiliar pang of concern tugging at him. He stopped, observing the mother and child with a growing sense of unease. "Excuse me, miss," he said finally, breaking the silence. She startled, looking up at him with wary, exhausted eyes. There was something fierce in her gaze, a flash of pride mixed with fear. "Yes?" she asked, her voice low and guarded. She drew her coat tighter around the boy. "It's quite cold tonight," he began, fumbling with his words. The usual confidence he wore at business meetings and social events faltered here. "I'd like to offer you some help, perhaps some money for a warmer place, just for the night." The woman shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No, thank you. We don't need anything." The tone in her voice left no room for argument, but Alexander, sensing the boy's slight movements as he stirred, couldn't let it go so easily. "Are you sure?" he asked, trying again. "Your son looks quite cold." She hesitated, looking down at the child and smoothing his hair. For a brief moment, Alexander saw something raw and vulnerable flash across her face. "I just want a safe place for him," she murmured, barely loud enough for him to hear. Alexander's hesitation melted away as he looked at the boy's small, shivering form. He took a deep breath, the usual calculating businessman within him replaced by something uncharacteristically selfless. "If it's just for him," he started carefully, "I have an apartment nearby. It's empty, clean, warm. You could both stay there for the night." The woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "An apartment? Just like that?" "Yes, just like that," he replied, holding her gaze. "It's an old property of mine, hardly used. A safe place for one night, at least. No strings attached." He shrugged. "I have no reason to lie." She looked at him long and hard, weighing his words. Finally, she sighed and nodded, standing up slowly and reaching down to gather the boy in her arms. He stirred, blinking up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mom?" he mumbled, rubbing his face with his small fists. "It's all right, baby. We're just going somewhere warmer," she whispered to him, giving his forehead a quick, gentle kiss. Alexander watched them for a moment, noticing the way she held her son with such fierce protection. He gestured for her to follow him, his steps quiet but quick as he led them down the quiet street toward the apartment building he owned a few blocks away. In the silence of the night, he could hear her whispering soft reassurances to the boy, her voice a soothing, constant hum. When they reached the building, Alexander punched in the security code and opened the door, holding it open for them. The lobby was dimly lit but warm, a welcome change from the icy wind outside. The boy's eyes widened as he looked around, clutching his mother's hand tightly. "Is this where we're staying?" he asked, his voice no louder than a whisper. "For tonight," Alexander replied, managing a small smile. He led them up the stairs, unlocking a modest but cozy apartment on the second floor. Inside, the lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over a small kitchen and living room area, decorated simply with a few pieces of furniture. The woman glanced around, visibly relaxing as she saw the space was genuinely empty and secure. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice softer now, almost reluctant. "You're welcome," Alexander replied, watching her with a hint of curiosity. He noticed her straight posture, the way she held herself with an almost stubborn dignity despite the worn clothes and tired expression. She shifted the boy in her arms, laying him gently on the couch and wrapping a thin blanket around him. The child yawned, blinking up at his mother with sleepy, trusting eyes before closing them, his small body finally relaxing in the warmth. Turning back to Alexander, she took a steady breath. "I'm Sarah, and I don't usually take help from strangers, but thank you for this." "Sarah," he repeated, nodding slowly. "I understand." He looked away, clearing his throat. I won't ask any more questions. Just make yourselves comfortable. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. Wait. She hesitated, her expression softening. I don't know why you did this, but it means a lot. To me and to him. For a moment, they looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Alexander nodded, then quietly closed the door behind him, leaving Sarah and her son alone in the warmth of the apartment. As he walked down the hallway, he felt an unfamiliar weight on his shoulders, as if he'd just crossed an invisible line between the life he knew and something entirely different. In the days that followed, Alexander couldn't shake the memory of Sarah and her son. He found himself glancing at the corner where he'd first seen them each time he walked to his office, wondering if they were all right or if they'd moved on. Eventually, the curiosity became too strong. After some hesitation, he decided to pay them a visit. The early morning sun cast a pale glow over the city as Alexander arrived at the small apartment building. He had no idea if Sarah would even open the door, but something inside him told him he needed to check. Taking a breath, he knocked gently. For a moment, silence. Then, footsteps approached, and the door opened just a crack. Sarah's wary eyes met his through the gap. It's you, she murmured, her voice tinged with surprise. Good morning, Alexander replied, a bit unsure himself. I just wanted to see how you and your son are settling in. Is it all right if I come in? Sarah looked at him, clearly weighing the situation. Finally, she opened the door wider, allowing him inside. The apartment was warm and faintly smelled of coffee. Her son was seated on the couch, drawing on a scrap of paper with a pencil, his small face focused and serious. Hi there, Alexander said, his voice softening as he addressed the boy. What's your name? The boy looked up, glancing at his mother for permission. She nodded, and he answered quietly, Ethan. Nice to meet you, Ethan, Alexander said, giving him a warm nod. That's a nice drawing. Ethan held up the paper shyly, revealing a sketch of what looked like a park scene, complete with trees and a big sun. Mom says I'm good at drawing, he said with a small, proud smile. Your mom is right, Alexander replied, glancing over at Sarah, who watched the interaction carefully. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. As he looked around the small apartment, Alexander noticed how meticulously clean it was. Despite the few belongings they had, Sarah had arranged everything neatly, making the space feel almost homelike. He gestured to the couch, silently asking if he could sit, and she nodded. They sat in a moment of comfortable silence as Ethan returned to his drawing. Eventually, Alexander turned to Sarah, his expression contemplative. Do you have any family nearby? He asked, careful not to sound too probing. She shook her head, her face shadowed with something unreadable. No, it's just us. She took a sip of coffee, her gaze drifting to Ethan. I've been doing my best, but life has a way of making things hard. Alexander nodded, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. I know it's not much, he said carefully, but I'd like to help you find something more permanent. For both of you. Sarah's eyes narrowed, suspicion edging into her expression again. Why? You don't even know us. He paused, searching for the right words. Maybe I see a little of myself in you, he admitted. Growing up wasn't exactly easy for me either. There were a lot of things I went through that I wouldn't want anyone else to face alone. She looked at him, surprised by his openness. I appreciate the offer, really, but I don't want charity. It's not charity, Alexander replied, his tone earnest. It's a helping hand. Take it or leave it. But I think you could use a little support right now. They locked eyes, the room silent but for the faint scratch of Ethan's pencil on paper. After a long pause, Sarah exhaled, nodding slowly. Maybe just for a little while, she said quietly. Until we're back on our feet. A faint smile tugged at Alexander's lips. That's all I'm offering. As they continued talking, he shared small stories from his own past. Moments of struggle that, though painful, had shaped him into who he was. To his own surprise, he found himself opening up in a way he hadn't done in years. And as Sarah listened, her guardedness softened. a look of understanding and respect filling her eyes. Little by little, the walls between them began to break down, each conversation peeling back layers of guarded pride and quiet resilience. Days passed, and the connection between Alexander, Sarah, and young Ethan deepened, almost against their will. Alexander would often stop by with small groceries or a book for Ethan, subtle gestures that Sarah would accept with a quiet nod of gratitude. But even as the days became routine, a nagging feeling began to grow in Alexander's mind, a flicker of recognition whenever he looked at Sarah, as though something about her was almost familiar. One chilly evening, after they had all shared a modest dinner in the small apartment, Alexander gathered his thoughts and finally broached the subject that had been weighing on him. "Sarah," he began, leaning forward as he studied her, "you mentioned once that you didn't have family nearby. But have you always been here in New York?" She hesitated, her fork pausing over her plate as she looked at him carefully. "No," she replied slowly. "I moved here when I was a teenager. I don't remember much of my life before that." Ethan, absorbed in a book Alexander had brought him, glanced up with mild interest but quickly returned to his story. Alexander's gaze didn't waver, though. "What do you mean you don't remember much?" he asked, his tone gentle but persistent. Sarah's expression grew distant, as if she were searching through half-forgotten memories. "I was told I was adopted when I was very young," she said, her voice soft. "My adoptive parents, they weren't the warmest people. I left as soon as I could and never really looked back." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine, though he kept his voice steady. "Do you remember anything? Maybe where you lived? Any family names?" She shook her head, frowning as if the question stirred something uncomfortable. "Bits and pieces," she admitted. "It's strange, but I sometimes get flashes of a face or a place, but nothing concrete. It's like trying to remember a dream." She looked away, almost embarrassed. "It's not exactly useful." For a moment, Alexander was silent. He leaned back, a thoughtful look in his eyes, as though piecing together fragments of a puzzle. "I don't know if this sounds strange," he said carefully, "but I'd like to help you look into it. You deserve to know more about where you came from." Sarah blinked, taken aback. "I don't know if that's necessary," she murmured, glancing at Ethan. "The past, it's just the past. I have Ethan now. He's all that matters. But maybe your past could bring you answers," Alexander replied, his tone quiet but compelling. "Or, at the very least, some peace. And if it doesn't, then you can leave it behind without any loose ends." She sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment, her gaze drifting over to Ethan, who was now scribbling something on the back of his book with a focused frown. She seemed to weigh Alexander's words, the idea of closure, before finally meeting his gaze. "All right," she said softly. "I guess it wouldn't hurt to know more." A faint smile appeared on Alexander's face, and he nodded. "I'll see what I can find. Maybe we can start with any names you remember, or the town you last lived in with your adoptive family." As they spoke, Sarah shared small fragments she could recall. The name of a town, a hospital, faint memories of a young woman with a kind face, and a voice that she thought might have been her mother's. The more she spoke, the more Alexander's unease grew, something intangible pressing at the back of his mind. Over the next few days, Alexander devoted himself to tracing any records, making calls, and visiting offices that might hold pieces of Sarah's history. And each step he took, he couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that her past was somehow entangled with his own. One evening, as he flipped through an old archive he had managed to access, a detail jumped out at him. A familiar name on a list of missing persons from decades ago. He stared at it, his heart pounding as he recognized the name of his own sister. The sister he had lost in a tragic accident long ago. Could it be? He sat back, stunned, questions flooding his mind. Had Sarah somehow survived, hidden away by some twist of fate? Alexander looked back at the file, his hands trembling. He knew he had to tread carefully. The days turned into restless nights as Alexander sifted through document after document, each one revealing fragments of a tragedy he had buried long ago. His sister's face, once vivid in his memory, had faded over the years into a shadowy image he could only recall in fragments. Yet here he was, staring at old records that hinted at an impossible truth. It gnawed at him, like an itch he couldn't scratch. One evening, unable to bear the suspense, he called Sarah and asked if he could stop by. She agreed, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Alexander arrived at the apartment carrying a worn, leather-bound album and a handful of old papers he'd unearthed from storage. As he stepped into the warmth of the apartment, he was met with the soft glow of dim lighting and the comforting scent of tea. Sarah looked at him, noticing his unease. "What's going on, Alexander?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. He took a seat across from her, placing the album gently on the table between them. Ethan was playing quietly on the floor, but Sarah kept her eyes on Alexander. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "Sarah, I don't really know how to say this," he began slowly, glancing down at his hands. "But as I looked into your past, I found things I never expected to see." She stiffened, her gaze hardening just a bit. "What did you find?" she asked cautiously, the old defenses rising in her posture. He opened the album, flipping carefully through the yellowed pages until he found a photograph of a young girl. She had the same deep eyes and quiet intensity that he had come to recognize in Sarah. The girl was smiling, her arms wrapped around a younger Alexander, both of them grinning up at the camera in a moment of pure happiness. "This," he said quietly, sliding the photograph over to her. "This is my sister." Sarah took the photo, her eyes widening as she examined the girl's face. There was something there, a strange familiarity, as if she were looking into a mirror from years past. Her hand trembled slightly, and she looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. You think I could be related to her?" He nodded, his voice thick. "It's possible. My sister. She went missing when I was young. There was an accident, and she disappeared. I always thought—" His voice trailed off, his throat tightening as he struggled with the memories. "I thought she was gone." Sarah's expression softened, her fingers grazing the edge of the photograph. "But how could that be?" she murmured, half to herself. "It's possible you were taken in by someone after the accident, that you were adopted without knowing your true family," Alexander replied. "You said you don't remember much from before your adoption. It might explain why." A silence settled between them, thick with disbelief and unspoken questions. Sarah turned the photograph over in her hands, her eyes fixed on the face of the young girl. "If this is true," she said slowly, as if testing the words, "then you're saying I might be your niece?" Alexander nodded, his eyes dark with emotion. "I don't want to assume anything, Sarah, but if there's even a chance, I think we owe it to ourselves, to you and to Ethan, to find out the truth." Sarah sat back, processing this revelation. Her guarded expression softened, and for the first time since Alexander had known her, a glimmer of vulnerability appeared in her eyes. "I never thought. I always assumed my past didn't matter, that it was better left forgotten." She glanced down at Ethan, who had fallen asleep on the floor, clutching a small toy. "But if this is true, it changes everything." Alexander took a steadying breath, nodding. "I can't even begin to imagine what this feels like for you," he said quietly. "But I want you to know. You don't have to go through it alone." Her eyes met his, a mix of fear and hope shimmering there. "Why are you doing this, Alexander?" she asked, her voice a mix of skepticism and gratitude. "Why do you care so much?" He looked away, searching for an answer even he didn't fully understand. "I think maybe I lost so much back then," he admitted softly. "Maybe helping you, helping Ethan. It's my way of trying to make things right." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The night deepened outside, casting shadows across the small apartment, but inside, the two sat quietly, bound by a new, unspoken understanding. Eventually, Sarah leaned forward, her face resolute. "I want to find out, Alexander," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever it takes, I want to know the truth." Alexander nodded, relief and determination flooding his expression. "Then we'll do it together." In the days that followed, they met with private investigators, pored over archives, and made countless calls. Each piece of information felt like another step toward an invisible line neither of them had dared cross before. And with each new discovery, the possibility of a shared past grew stronger, more certain, until there was no room left for doubt. One afternoon, after a particularly revealing meeting with a contact at the adoption agency, Alexander and Sarah walked back to the apartment in silence. The weight of what they had uncovered hung heavily between them. It was real now, undeniable. The scattered pieces of Sarah's past aligned with the family Alexander had lost, a family shattered by tragedy. When they reached her door, Sarah turned to him, her face pale and her voice trembling. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" "Yes," he replied, his own voice a whisper. "But maybe it's also a chance to start again." The truth, once undeniable, shattered the quiet routines Alexander and Sarah had built, leaving in its place a tense, brittle silence. The confirmation of their connection, the knowledge that Sarah was, in fact, his niece, opened up wounds neither of them had been prepared for. And tonight, the weight of it hung thickly in the air as Alexander stood at Sarah's door, his stomach churning with a nervous energy he hadn't felt in years. He knew they had to talk, but he had no idea how to begin. When Sarah opened the door, her face was pale and drawn, her usual guarded expression replaced with something raw and unsettled. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting him in. Alexander entered, casting a glance toward Ethan's room, where the boy's soft breathing could be heard in the quiet of the apartment. Sarah closed the door behind him, taking a steadying breath before turning to face him. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the full weight of her anger, her pain. "Why didn't you look for me, Alexander?" The accusation cut through him, sharper than he'd expected, and he swallowed, feeling his heart thud painfully in his chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words died on his tongue as he took in the grief in her eyes, the anger he could see she'd been holding back. I thought you were gone," he finally managed, his voice rough. "There was an accident. Our parents, my sister, everyone thought you hadn't survived." Sarah's eyes blazed, her jaw tight. "That's it? You just assumed I was dead and moved on?" The words stung, and he had to force himself to hold her gaze. "I was young, Sarah, just a teenager myself. After the accident, I had no one. It was years before I could even think about those memories without falling apart." He looked away, his fists clenching at his sides. "And when I finally did, there was nothing to find. No clues, no records. I wanted to believe you were somewhere safe, with a family who loved you." Her voice shook, her anger barely restrained. "But I wasn't safe. I grew up in a house where I never felt wanted, never felt like I belonged. They told me I was lucky to be adopted, that I should be grateful. But I was alone, Alexander. All those years, I was alone." He took a step closer, his face lined with regret, his voice raw. "If I'd known, if I had the slightest idea." He stopped himself, realizing how hollow those words sounded, but he pressed on, desperation creeping into his tone. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't make up for anything. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I would have done anything to change it." For a moment, she looked as though she might lash out, her whole body tense with the weight of everything she'd buried for years. But then, as she looked at him, the anger in her eyes began to soften, replaced by a sadness that cut even deeper. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Your family, and I don't even know you. I don't know anything about you, about what our life was supposed to be." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And I don't know if I want to know." Alexander felt the tightness in his chest intensify, and he reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away, her eyes filled with conflict as she looked up at him. "I understand," he said softly. "You don't have to forgive me, Sarah, but I want you to know that I'm here now. For you, for Ethan. I want to be here for you both." She closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her emotions. They stood like that for a long moment, the silence heavy yet filled with the unspoken grief that neither of them could put into words. Finally, Sarah opened her eyes, her expression shifting from anger to resignation. Maybe we can try," she whispered. "But this doesn't make up for anything. I don't know if it ever will." Alexander nodded, understanding that this was the best he could hope for. One step at a time, he agreed quietly. As they both sat down on the couch, the weight of the revelation lingered, like the aftermath of a storm. Sarah reached out, absently picking up a photo album Alexander had brought with him, a book he'd put together of their family, of memories he'd long kept to himself. She flipped through the pages in silence, her eyes scanning the faded photographs of people she'd never truly known. "Is that your sister?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she pointed to a picture of a young woman with bright eyes and an infectious smile. Alexander nodded, his throat tight. "That's my sister, your mother. She was a kind, gentle person, always looking out for everyone else. I think she would have loved to know you." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she looked at the photograph, tracing her mother's face with trembling fingers. "I don't remember her," she admitted, her voice full of pain. "I wish I did. I wish I had even one memory." "You can ask me anything you want to know about her," Alexander offered, his voice soft and steady. "Anything you need, I'll tell you." "She would have wanted you to know," Sarah nodded, brushing the tear away quickly, as if ashamed to show that vulnerability. She looked away, composing herself, and then turned back to him. "Tell me about her," she whispered. "Tell me what she was like." And so he did. For the next hour, Alexander told her stories, little memories he'd held onto all these years. The time she had helped him study late into the night, the way she laughed, the way she'd sing lullabies that echoed through the house. He described her as best he could, painting a picture of the mother Sarah had never known. And as he spoke, Sarah listened, absorbing each word, her anger softened by the bittersweet beauty of the memories he shared. When he finally finished, Sarah sat quietly, her head bowed as she processed it all. There was a stillness in her that hadn't been there before, a fragile peace that seemed to settle over her like a gentle snowfall. But as Alexander rose to leave, she looked up, her eyes fierce once more. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," she said, her voice low and steady. "But thank you for tonight." He nodded, understanding. "That's more than I deserve," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to leave, but at the last moment, he looked back, his eyes meeting hers. "Good night, Sarah. I'll see you tomorrow." And as the door closed behind him, Alexander walked down the hallway with a new sense of purpose. The journey toward healing would be long and fraught with pain, but he was determined to be there for Sarah and Ethan, to be the family they both needed, for however long it would take. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander, Sarah, and Ethan found themselves building a hesitant, fragile bond. The tension between Alexander and Sarah hadn't fully dissolved, but a mutual understanding had started to grow, like the first signs of spring pushing through frostbitten ground. They saw each other nearly every day, sometimes meeting in the afternoons when Alexander had a break from work, sometimes over quiet dinners where Ethan's laughter gradually softened the unease between the adults. One cool, bright afternoon, Alexander invited them to a small park near his home. As they walked among the towering trees, their golden leaves scattering in the wind, Alexander watched Ethan dart ahead to chase after fallen leaves, the child's laughter filling the air. Sarah walked beside Alexander, silent and introspective, her gaze occasionally drifting toward her son with a protective warmth. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache of regret well up within him. "It's nice to see him so happy," he said softly, watching Ethan with a faint smile. "It's moments like these that make me realize how much family can matter." Sarah looked at him, her expression cautious but not as guarded as it once had been. "I didn't know much about family until all of this," she admitted quietly. "It's strange. I'm still figuring out what it means." "I understand," he replied, his voice gentle. "For years, I tried to put all of it behind me, burying any thoughts of my sister, my parents, even you. It felt like the only way to keep going." She nodded, absorbing his words, her fingers trailing absently along the edge of a park bench as they passed. "I guess we're both learning what it means, then." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the air crisp and cool. Finally, Sarah spoke up, her voice hesitant. "I'm grateful, for everything you've done. I never would have been able to start piecing things together on my own. Her words were laced with vulnerability, and Alexander sensed how hard it was for her to say them. You don't have to thank me, Sarah, he replied, a touch of sadness in his voice. I would have done it no matter what. You're my family. I should have been there for you from the beginning. Sarah's expression softened, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile crept onto her face. Maybe it's not about where we started. Maybe it's about where we are now. Alexander felt a warmth spread through him, a fragile yet powerful sense of hope that he hadn't known in years. He watched as Ethan skipped back toward them, holding a handful of bright leaves. Mom, look, the boy exclaimed, his face shining with excitement as he showed Sarah the collection of autumn colors. They're beautiful, Ethan, Sarah said, her voice warm and affectionate as she tousled his hair. She glanced up at Alexander, her gaze softer now, less guarded. He's been so happy lately. I think he feels safer. It means everything to me. They stood like that for a moment, Alexander taking in the gentle scene. His heart tightened as he realized just how deeply he wanted to be a part of this, of their lives. He wanted to see Ethan grow up, to be there for both of them, not as a stranger or an outsider, but as family. And for the first time, he dared to hope that Sarah might be open to that as well. As they left the park, Ethan's hand slipped into Alexander's, and he looked up, his eyes bright. Can we come back here, Uncle Alex? He asked, his voice innocent and hopeful. The words caught Alexander off guard. He looked down at Ethan, a lump forming in his throat. Of course we can, Ethan, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Anytime you want. They spent the rest of the day together, stopping for ice cream at a nearby shop and laughing as Ethan smeared chocolate across his face. The day felt almost surreal to Alexander, like a dream he hadn't dared to hope for. It was only when the sun began to dip below the horizon that they started their walk back to Sarah's apartment, Ethan sleepily leaning his head against his mother's shoulder. When they arrived, Sarah unlocked the door and paused, turning to look at Alexander. Her expression was unreadable, as though she was debating something with herself. Do you want to come in for a bit? She asked quietly. I could make some tea if you'd like. He nodded, a warmth spreading through him. I'd like that. Inside, the apartment felt cozier than ever. The soft hum of the kettle filled the silence as Sarah moved about the small kitchen, and Alexander settled onto the couch, watching her with a quiet contentment. Ethan, already half asleep, was curled up under a blanket, his small chest rising and falling in gentle rhythms. Sarah brought 2 cups of tea over, handing one to Alexander before sitting down beside him. For a long time, they sipped their tea in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice almost a whisper. I was so angry at you, you know? At first, all I could feel was anger, at you, at everyone who wasn't there. But now I'm starting to realize that maybe it was just fear. Fear that I'd let you in and lose everything again. Alexander felt his chest tighten. You don't have to be afraid, Sarah, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm not going anywhere. Not again. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment, he could see the cracks in her armor, the small, fragile hope that had begun to form within her. She gave a tiny nod, letting out a shaky breath. Then maybe, she said softly, we really do have a chance to be family. They sat in silence, the words settling between them like a promise. As the winter months crept in, Alexander found himself spending more time with Sarah and Ethan, the once fragile bond between them growing stronger with each visit. He had become a steady presence in their lives, and more than once, he'd arrived to find Ethan waiting eagerly at the window, waving enthusiastically the moment he saw him. One chilly evening, Alexander sat across from Sarah at her kitchen table after dinner, the warm glow of the room contrasting with the howling wind outside. Sarah cleared away the dishes, a thoughtful expression on her face. For days now, she'd seemed preoccupied, lost in thought, as though some idea had taken root in her mind but hadn't yet fully blossomed. Alexander, she began hesitantly, returning to her seat across from him. I wanted to talk to you about something. He set down his cup, his attention fully on her. Of course, he said, nodding for her to continue. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about Ethan and me, and you coming back into our lives. She paused, glancing down at her hands, then back up at him. I keep wondering if there's a way for all of this to mean something. Something beyond just us. Alexander furrowed his brow, intrigued. What do you mean? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. I want to help people like us, people who felt abandoned, who don't have anywhere to go. Families, mothers, children, people who need a second chance. Her voice grew stronger with each word, a passion shining through that he hadn't seen before. I think maybe we could start something together. A foundation or a support network for mothers and children who are struggling. Alexander's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but slowly, a smile spread across his face as he took in her words. You want to create a foundation? He repeated, his voice full of admiration. A place where people in need can find shelter, support, maybe even hope? She nodded, a spark of excitement in her eyes. Yes, something like that. I know it sounds crazy, and it would be a huge effort, but I feel like it's the right thing to do. Like it's what I'm supposed to do. I don't want Ethan to grow up thinking that we're alone, that we're different from everyone else. I want him to see that even when life is hard, there's still a way to make a difference. Alexander watched her, deeply moved. He could see how much this meant to her, how it was fueled not only by her own pain but by the resilience she'd had to build over the years. He leaned forward, his face full of genuine encouragement. Sarah, it's not crazy. In fact, I think it's incredible. And I'd be honored to help you make it happen. A look of relief passed over her face, and her shoulders relaxed as though a weight had been lifted. Thank you, Alexander, she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. I didn't want to do this alone. I couldn't do it alone. He nodded, already feeling the excitement of the idea building inside him. Then let's do it together. We'll find the resources, get the right people involved. I have contacts in the city, people who would be willing to support a cause like this. He paused, his expression thoughtful. But, Sarah, this isn't just going to be a project. It's going to change lives, yours included. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. I know, she said, and that's what I want. In the weeks that followed, their lives became a whirlwind of meetings, planning, and preparation. They met with lawyers to establish the foundation, designers to draft the branding, and city officials to secure permits. Each day was filled with work, challenges, and unexpected setbacks, but they tackled them together, their shared commitment growing stronger with every obstacle. One evening, after a long meeting with a potential donor, Alexander and Sarah walked back to her apartment, the cold wind nipping at their faces as they exchanged ideas, each more excited than the last. Imagine the impact we could have, Alexander said, his voice brimming with optimism. Families who have nowhere else to go, kids who need a safe place to sleep. We could give them a second chance, just like you and Ethan got. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright despite her exhaustion. It feels surreal, like a dream. But it's happening, Alexander. And it's all because of you. He shook his head, smiling. It's because of us, Sarah. This was your idea, your passion. I'm just here to support it, to help make it real. When they arrived at her apartment, Ethan ran up to greet them, his face lighting up as he saw Alexander. Uncle Alex, did you bring me anything? Alexander laughed, pulling a small book from his coat pocket. I brought you a story, little man, he said, handing the book to Ethan. Maybe your mom will read it to you tonight. Ethan's eyes sparkled with excitement as he clutched the book to his chest. Thank you, he exclaimed, darting over to show it to his mother. Sarah looked up at Alexander, her expression warm and filled with gratitude. Thank you for today, she said softly, and for everything else. It's my pleasure, he replied, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment. Really, as the months went on, the foundation began to take shape, and Alexander could see the transformation it brought in Sarah. She was more confident, her sense of purpose grounding her in a way that was both inspiring and humbling to watch. They worked tirelessly, often late into the night, until their vision became a reality. Soon, They were standing outside the newly renovated building that would house the foundation, its doors ready to open to families in need. On the morning of the opening, Alexander arrived early, taking a moment to absorb the sight of what they'd created together. The building, a renovated brownstone, stood proudly in the heart of the neighborhood, its sign gleaming in the morning sun. The Second Chances Foundation for Families. Sarah appeared beside him, looking at the building with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I can't believe it," she whispered. It's real." He smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did this, Sarah. You turned your pain into something that will change lives." She turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't try to hide. "I couldn't have done it without you, Alexander." They stood together in silence, taking in the moment, feeling the weight of everything that had led them to this point. And as the doors opened for the first families to enter, Alexander and Sarah watched, side by side, as their vision came to life. The foundation had opened its doors just a few months ago, but already, the building felt alive with purpose. Every corner of the space echoed with quiet voices, laughter, and sometimes tears. Families came and went, each carrying their own histories, their own struggles, and a need for the safety the foundation provided. Sarah and Alexander worked side by side almost every day, their roles as co-founders becoming a lifeline not only for those they helped, but for themselves as well. One evening, as twilight settled over the city, Alexander sat in his small office on the second floor, sifting through paperwork. He had stayed late again, engrossed in the numbers and figures that came with running a nonprofit. There was a quiet knock on his door, and he looked up to see Sarah leaning against the frame, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the hallway light. "You're still here," she remarked, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. She carried 2 steaming mugs and placed one on his desk. He glanced at the mug and smiled, grateful for the warmth. "I could say the same about you," he replied, leaning back in his chair and taking a sip of the tea. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head, a tired smile crossing her face. "No, not really. I kept thinking about Mrs. Ramirez and her kids. They've been through so much. I couldn't stop worrying about them." He nodded, understanding immediately. Mrs. Ramirez, a young mother of 3, had come to them just a week before, escaping a situation so dangerous she'd left with only the clothes on her back and her children clinging to her. "She's stronger than she realizes," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "They all are." A silence settled between them, comfortable yet full of unspoken thoughts. Sarah took a seat across from him, cradling her mug in her hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I would have been able to get through everything without you," she admitted quietly. "Or without this place. It's given me something I didn't even know I was missing." Alexander looked at her, his eyes softening. "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Sarah. You would have found a way. But I'm glad I could be here. And I'm glad that we could make this happen together." She smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's strange, isn't it? How something as broken as our past could lead to something like this, to helping people who need it most." Her gaze drifted to the window, looking out over the city lights, her face lost in thought. "I used to think all those things, my adoption, the years alone, all of it, was just random, meaningless suffering. But now, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't all for nothing." Alexander reached across the desk, placing his hand gently over hers. "Maybe that's what we're supposed to do with our pain. Use it to make something better for someone else." She looked at him, her hand unmoving under his. The connection between them, unspoken and fragile, had become a steady anchor. In the quiet of the foundation, they'd found not only purpose but a sense of belonging that neither of them had dared to hope for. A knock on the door interrupted them, and they both turned to see Ethan peeking in, rubbing his sleepy eyes and holding his favorite stuffed bear. "Mom? Uncle Alex?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Can I stay with you? I had a bad dream." Sarah immediately stood, gathering him into her arms as he yawned and nuzzled into her shoulder. "Of course, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice filled with warmth. She looked over at Alexander with a small, almost embarrassed smile. "We can head home. Sorry if we kept you too long." But Alexander shook his head. No, it's fine, he said, getting up. Actually, why don't we all stay here tonight? He glanced at Ethan, who perked up at the idea. We have all these empty rooms. It could be an adventure. Ethan's eyes lit up, and he gave a small, sleepy cheer. An adventure? He repeated, excitement returning to his voice. Sarah chuckled, nodding. All right, an adventure it is, she agreed, carrying him down the hall as Alexander followed. They picked out one of the newly furnished rooms on the third floor, a warm space meant for mothers with young children. The walls were painted a soft yellow, and there was a comfortable bed with plenty of space for the three of them. Ethan quickly nestled into the blankets, his small hands clutching his bear as he drifted off again. Sarah sat beside him, stroking his hair as he fell back asleep, his face peaceful in the soft glow of the room's dim light. Alexander watched them, feeling an overwhelming sense of contentment, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. This, he realized, was what family felt like. Sarah looked over at him, patting the space beside her, and Alexander joined her, sitting down on the edge of the bed. They sat there quietly, watching Ethan's steady breathing. This foundation, she whispered, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her. I think it saved me just as much as it's saving the people who come here. Maybe even more. He nodded, his gaze never leaving Ethan. I know what you mean, he replied. I think it's given all of us something we needed. Something to believe in. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes as a wave of exhaustion overtook her. They sat in silence, their breathing matching the quiet rhythm of Ethan's. In that moment, Alexander realized that he'd found the family he thought he'd lost forever. They stayed like that for a long time, neither wanting to break the peace of the moment. It was as though the three of them were bound together by an unbreakable thread, one woven from shared pain, resilience, and the desire to create something good from the hardships they had endured. Finally, Sarah stirred, her eyes still closed. You know, I always thought I'd never trust anyone. After everything, I just didn't think it was possible. Her voice was barely audible. But I trust you, Alexander. I really do. He felt her words settle deep within him, filling a void he hadn't even realized was there. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, a silent promise that he would protect her and Ethan, that he would never let them down again. As the night wore on, they drifted into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts but comforted by the presence of the other. Eventually, Alexander lay down beside them, his own eyes growing heavy as the weight of the day's work finally caught up with him. They stayed like that, the three of them, tangled together in the soft glow of the Foundation's quiet sanctuary. In the months to come, the Foundation continued to thrive. More families came, each with their own story, each finding a safe haven within its walls. And through it all, Alexander, Sarah, and Ethan were there, a quiet, steady force offering the support, strength, and love that they had once longed for themselves. The Foundation, in a way, became a symbol of their journey, proof that out of brokenness could come hope, and from loss, a new beginning. And as they moved forward together, they found that, finally, they had become the family they were always meant to be. The day of the official inauguration of the Foundation dawned cold and clear, a stark winter sky stretching endlessly above New York as people began to gather. Alexander stood outside, breathing in the crisp air as he looked at the building, pride swelling within him. This was it, the day they had worked so tirelessly for, a day that felt like a triumph over the shadows of their past. The Second Chances Foundation wasn't just a building or an organization. It was a home, a safe haven for those who had once been lost, just as he and Sarah had been. As the first guests arrived, city officials, donors, families who had already been helped, Alexander greeted each with a handshake and a warm smile, watching as they filled the entryway and spilled into the newly furnished common rooms. The Foundation was alive with energy, laughter, and conversation echoing against the walls, each sound a testament to the promise that had brought them here. Inside, Sarah moved among the guests, her face a mixture of nerves and excitement. She held Ethan's hand tightly, her eyes shining with gratitude as she introduced him to those who had supported their work. Ethan was growing into a confident, happy child, and seeing him like this filled her heart with a warmth she could hardly put into words. She caught Alexander's eye across the room, giving him a small, proud smile that said everything they had both worked so hard to express. As the hour for the speeches approached, the crowd settled in the main common area, a beautiful room with soft lighting and large windows that overlooked the busy street outside. A small stage had been set up, and Alexander took his place at the podium, the hum of conversation fading as all eyes turned to him. He took a moment, letting the quiet settle over the crowd as he scanned the faces before him, lingering on Sarah and Ethan standing near the front. For the first time in his life, he felt at home, not in a physical space, but in the presence of these people who had become his family. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he began. Today, as we open the doors to the Second Chances Foundation, we celebrate something far greater than just a building, he began, his voice carrying through the room. This place represents the hope, strength, and resilience that each of you has shown by standing here with us today. It is a testament to the idea that no one should ever feel alone, that no matter how lost or broken life may make us feel, there is always a way forward. He paused, glancing at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. I have seen firsthand the power of a second chance. It saved me, and it brought me back to a family I thought I'd lost forever. His voice grew softer, his gaze fixed on Sarah and Ethan. To my family, my sister's daughter, who I am so grateful to have in my life again, and to her son, Ethan, who has brought joy and meaning into every day, thank you. Thank you for letting me be a part of your lives. A few people dabbed at their eyes as Alexander continued, his voice steady and full of purpose. I want everyone who walks through these doors to know that they, too, have a family here, that we are here to listen, to understand, and to help them build the lives they deserve. This foundation belongs to each and every person who has ever felt forgotten or overlooked, who has ever needed a safe place to rest. He took a deep breath, glancing around at the room filled with friends, supporters, and those who had already been touched by the Foundation's mission. This is just the beginning. Together, we'll keep growing, keep reaching those who need us. We will be a family for them, a source of hope and strength. That is our promise. As he finished, the room erupted in applause. Alexander stepped back, nodding as Sarah came up beside him. Her face was glowing with pride, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She took the microphone, glancing around the room before speaking. Thank you, all of you, for being here, she said, her voice wavering slightly as she looked over the audience. This foundation, it has changed my life in ways I never imagined. I came from a place of hurt and loneliness, and I never thought I'd have a family, or a purpose, or a chance to help others the way I was helped. Her voice softened as she looked at Alexander. I never thought I'd have a second chance at family. The applause swelled once again, filling the room with warmth and celebration. As she stepped down, she embraced Alexander, her arms wrapping tightly around him as though she was finally letting go of years of pain and distrust. He held her, feeling the depth of what they had both overcome. They were no longer haunted by their past. They had finally found a future together. The ceremony continued with tours, shared stories, and laughter. As the day wore on, families and children filled the common areas, exploring the rooms, gathering in small groups, and sharing their own stories. There were mothers and children, young couples, people who had arrived with only the clothes on their backs, but who now had a place to call home, at least for a while. At one point, Alexander found himself watching Ethan play with some of the other children, his laughter ringing out as he ran through the hallways, his cheeks flushed with excitement. The sight filled Alexander with a deep, almost overwhelming sense of peace. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, this was worth every sacrifice he had ever made. As the evening drew to a close, the crowd began to thin. Sarah and Alexander remained behind, straightening chairs, clearing away leftover plates, and chatting with the few families who lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of the foundation. When the last guests had gone, the quiet of the building settled around them, a peaceful contrast to the energy that had filled it just hours before. They walked through the now empty rooms together, pausing to look at the little touches they'd worked so hard on. The comfortable furniture, The bookshelves filled with stories for all ages, the play area where children could escape, even if only for a moment, from the weight of their struggles. As they reached the front entrance, Sarah turned to him, her expression soft. "Thank you, Alexander," she whispered, her voice full of sincerity. "For everything. For coming back into our lives, for helping me, for giving us a chance to rebuild, and for believing in us." He smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Thank you, Sarah, for letting me be a part of your family, for trusting me. You and Ethan. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of their journey settling over them like a gentle snowfall. In that quiet, with the foundation's doors behind them and the night stretching out ahead, they knew they had come full circle. The foundation had become more than just a safe haven. It had become a symbol of everything they'd built together, a testament to the power of family, resilience, and love. As they finally turned off the lights and locked the doors, Alexander and Sarah walked into the cool night, side by side, their future open and unwritten, but brighter than either of them had ever imagined. They were family now, bound by blood, by shared struggle, and by a love that had survived every storm. The years passed quietly, marked by small, steady moments that built a lifetime. The foundation flourished, expanding beyond what Sarah and Alexander had ever imagined. New buildings were added, more families found sanctuary, and a team of dedicated staff grew to support the constant flow of people seeking a fresh start. Each success felt like a personal victory, a reminder that the foundation's work was more than just a mission. It was a legacy. Ethan grew up within the walls of the foundation, his childhood colored by the presence of people from all walks of life. From a young age, he understood the importance of helping others, often assisting his mother and uncle with small tasks, offering his toys to children who had none, or simply sitting with newcomers, his innocent curiosity a comforting welcome for those in need. To him, the foundation was a second home, a place where he felt safe and loved, where the faces of those around him changed but the warmth remained constant. As he entered his teenage years, Ethan's bond with Alexander deepened. Alexander became more than just an uncle to him. He became a mentor and a confidant, guiding him through school, cheering him on at soccer games, and sharing wisdom he'd learned through the years. Alexander had never been a father himself, but he grew into that role with Ethan, finding a joy in their relationship he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, years after the foundation's grand opening, Ethan approached Alexander with a question that had been on his mind for a while. They were sitting on a park bench near the foundation, watching the sun set over the city as the lights began to blink on in the distance. "Uncle Alex," Ethan began, his voice hesitant, "do you ever think about what it would have been like if you'd never found us?" Alexander turned to him, a soft smile on his face. He took a moment, as if weighing his answer, his gaze drifting over the familiar buildings and bustling streets of the city. "You know, Ethan," he said finally, "I think about it all the time. I wonder what kind of person I would have become. Probably someone very different." He paused, his smile deepening. "But I can tell you this. Finding you and your mom was the best thing that ever happened to me." Ethan looked down, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm glad you did," he murmured. "I don't think I'd be who I am without you." The simplicity of the moment filled Alexander's heart, a quiet joy settling over him. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Neither would I," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Neither would I." As the years continued to pass, Sarah and Alexander remained dedicated to the foundation, their roles evolving as new generations took on more responsibilities. The foundation became a landmark in the city, a symbol of hope and transformation. People came from across the country, drawn by stories of the sanctuary that had saved so many lives, of the people who had rebuilt themselves within its walls. At each anniversary of the foundation's opening, Alexander and Sarah hosted a small celebration, inviting families they had helped, past and present, to join them. The event was always full of laughter, memories, and reunions, with people swapping stories of their lives since leaving the foundation's embrace. For many, it was a family reunion, a chance to reconnect with the people who had shared their struggles and triumphs. Sarah and Alexander moved through the crowd each year, listening, smiling, and occasionally wiping away tears as former residents shared their gratitude. On one such anniversary, years into the future, Alexander found himself standing in the Foundation's common room, now expanded to accommodate the ever-growing family of past residents. The room was filled with laughter, and he watched with pride as Ethan, now a young man, led a tour for new visitors, explaining the work of the Foundation with the same passion and warmth his mother had once shown. Ethan had become an integral part of the Foundation's story, and as Alexander watched him, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Sarah approached him, a fond smile on her face as she watched her son. "He's going to be amazing here, isn't he?" she whispered, her voice full of love and pride. Alexander nodded, his gaze still on Ethan. "He already is. You've raised a good man, Sarah." She looked at him, gratitude softening her features. "We did, Alexander." Together, they stood side by side, watching as Ethan interacted with the guests, his presence radiating warmth and confidence. In that moment, Alexander realized that their legacy would continue in ways they'd never imagined. The Foundation would live on, not just through its work, but through the lives it had touched, through Ethan and everyone who had found a second chance within its walls. Years later, when Alexander finally retired from his daily responsibilities at the Foundation, he did so with a deep sense of peace. The building had grown beyond him, its roots firmly established, its branches reaching out into the community. Ethan had taken on a leadership role, his own vision building upon the Foundation's original mission while adding new programs and resources for families in need. Sarah remained a guiding force, her heart and compassion shaping every decision, every program, every family they welcomed. On the day of his retirement, a small ceremony was held in his honor, attended by friends, family, and hundreds of former residents whose lives had been changed by the Foundation. Ethan and Sarah stood by his side, their pride evident as they celebrated the man who had given so much to build a home for others. As he looked out over the crowd, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had once been a man haunted by loss and regret, by the shadows of a family he thought he would never see again. But through the Foundation, through Sarah and Ethan, he had found redemption and a love that had filled every empty corner of his heart. When the speeches were over, Alexander stood quietly in the common room, looking around one last time. He felt Sarah and Ethan's arms around him, their quiet support a steady presence, and as he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of his sister, his parents, the people he had loved and lost, and he knew that he had finally come full circle. He had found his family. He had built something that would live on long after he was gone. And as he stepped into the quiet of the evening with Sarah and Ethan by his side, he knew that his journey was complete. In the end, it wasn't about the past he had lost, but the future he had created. The Foundation, like the love he had found, would endure, steady, unwavering, a light for those still finding their way home.